Chapter 6, Part 2, Potter Committee Testimony. A brief recap from Part 1 of Chapter 6 to set the scene before Mr. Tilden's testimony begins. The subcommittee consisted of Hunton, of Virginia, the chairman, Springer, of Illinois, Stenger, of Pennsylvania, Hiscock, of New York, and Reed, of Maine, the first 3 Democrats and the last 2 Republicans. On Saturday, same day of his 65th birthday, 9th of February, by special arrangement Mr. Tilden appeared before the committee. It was a fearful ordeal. He was very feeble. His voice was scarcely audible above a whisper. The occasion was one of unusual impressiveness, especially when the cross-examination commenced. It soon became apparent that the Republican examiners were in the hands of their master. Before they had finished, Tilden had changed places with them, and put them on the stand in defense of the administration. At 11:30 Mr. Tilden appeared, in company with his brother, Henry Tilden, and ex-Secretary of State John Bigelow. Mr. Tilden was dressed in black, and had an air of great solemnity on his face, which looked as imperturbable and sphinx-like as ever. Since his last public appearance he seemed to have aged considerably, and yesterday he looked quite ill and feeble. As he afterward explained, he was suffering from a severe cold. It was, indeed, quite a painful spectacle to see the slow, halting, lame walk with which he passed the table and reached his seat. His figure was stiffly drawn up and seemed incapable of bending, as though he were suffering from a paralytic contraction of the limbs. As he entered, every eye was curiously turned upon him. Not a muscle of his face relaxed with animation or expression as he stiffly extended his hand to Mr. Reed, of Maine, who received the salutation with something like a profound bow. Then Mr. Tilden gave his hand to Mr. Hiscock, the other Republican cross-examiner, and after saluting the Democratic members took off his elegant, silk-lined overcoat, stiffly turned round and seated himself at the table, while settling at the same time a large handkerchief in his break pocket. Ex-Governor Tilden sat erect in his chair for over 2 hours and a half, and during the greater portion of this time he gave his testimony in that calm, quiet, imperturbable manner peculiar to him, and without hardly moving a muscle or changing the expression of his countenance. The official report of his examination was as follows: Testimony of Mr. Tilden before a select committee of Congress in relation to the cipher dispatches. The situation was enough to have paralyzed and crushed a man of less nerve, less conscious of his ability to demonstrate the factious motives which had placed him in that position, and with less faith than his in the ultimate triumph of innocence and justice. The audience chamber was crowded almost to suffocation. Since the examination of Dr. Franklin by the Privy Council in London, in 1774, there has been no public hearing, I believe, in which there have been such vast and grave interests at stake upon the testimony of a single individual. After Mr. Tilden had been sworn, the chairman of the committee said,
Governor Tilden, we received your note requesting permission to appear before this committee and testify, and we shall be glad to hear anything you have to say upon the subject of these cipher telegrams, subject to cross-examination when you are through.
Mr. Tilden, I have not had an opportunity to see the lithographic copies of the cipher telegrams.
Chairman, will you be kind enough, Governor Tilden, to speak a little louder?
Tilden, if you will excuse me, I have a slight cold, but I will speak as loud as I can. Upon publication of the cipher telegrams in the New York Tribune, those relating to South Carolina, on the 16th of October, 1878, and those relating to Florida on the 8th of October, 1878. I read those translations. I did not recognize among them a single one that I had ever seen in cipher or translation, or the contents of which had in any way been made known to me. With respect to those of them that relate to negotiations to induce members of the canvassing boards of South Carolina and Florida to give the Democratic electors their certificates, I swear positively that I never saw one of those telegrams, either in cipher or translation. The contents of no one of them, nor the purport of any one of them, was communicated to me in any manner whatever. I had no knowledge, no information, no suspicion that such a Correspondence had existed until their publication was announced in the New York Tribune, followed by the publication a few days later. No offer, no negotiation in behalf of any member of the returning board of South Carolina, of the Board of State Canvassers of Florida, or of any state was ever entertained by me, or by my authority or with my sanction. No negotiations with them, no dealing with them, no dealing with any one of them was ever authorized or sanctioned by me in any manner whatsoever. The first information I ever received that any such negotiation had ever existed between any Democrat and any member of the Board of State Canvassers of South Carolina to give their certificates to the Democratic electors was on the 20th day of November, 1876. I am not able to fix that date positively by my own recollection, but I fix it by circumstances. It was the day that Colonel Pelton was in Baltimore. I remember the fact and fix the date from the circumstances that have appeared during this investigation. On the morning of the 20th of November, 1876, Mrs. Colonel Pelton mentioned in my presence that her husband had gone to Philadelphia. It was a casual mention. I did not know that he was going to leave the city or that he had left the city until she mentioned it, and her mention of it was so casual as not to attract any attention. A little later in the morning,
The chairman. Do you mean Philadelphia?
Mr. Tilden, Philadelphia. A little later in the same morning I was called on by the treasurer of the National Democratic Committee, Mr. Edward Cooper, apparently on his way downtown. He told me that Colonel Pelton was in Baltimore. He told me that Colonel Pelton had received, or was receiving, an offer in behalf of somebody representing, or claiming to represent, the canvassers of the state of South Carolina, to give their certificate to the Democratic electors for a sum of money. I immediately said that no such offer should be entertained, that no negotiations of that nature should be tolerated, that not a cent of money should be furnished for any such purpose, and that Colonel Pelton must be immediately telegraphed to return to New York. I did not at that time know that Mr. Smith M. Weed had gone to South Carolina, or that he was there, or that he had been there at any time. I had not seen him after the election, and had no information of his whereabouts at that time. The conversation with Mr. Cooper was very brief. The whole matter was disposed of within 5 to 10 minutes. I made no inquiry into details, and there was no discussion between us. Mr. Cooper concurred with me entirely in the measures to be taken, and although I took it for granted that he would make every necessary communication on that subject, I did not leave it to that. I obtained from him Colonel Pelton's address in Baltimore and caused him to be immediately telegraphed to in a peremptory manner to return to New York. My dispatch was in ordinary language. I had no cipher. I could not read a cipher. I could not translate into a cipher. It never occurred to me that there was any reason for any concealment. My belief is that the dispatch was sent in my own name. I think it was sent within 10 minutes after Mr. Cooper's communication to me. Colonel Pelton returned that night to New York. With respect to Florida, I never saw any one of the Florida telegrams either in cipher or in translation. The contents of not one of them, so far as I know, were ever communicated to me, I mean the telegrams relating to this subject, and I do not think that the contents of those relating to the course of the controversy down there were communicated to me. I am not able, in looking them over, to recall any one of them that I have ever seen. I did not know, and I was not informed, that there had been any offer from anybody claiming to represent the Florida Board or any member of it to give their certificates to the Democratic electors until after the certificates had been delivered and a vote of the electors deposited for transmission to Washington. My first information on the subject was subsequent to that, after the 6th day of December, 1876. Sometime after Mr. Marble returned, I do not know when, whether it was before I went to England or not, he mentioned to me one day, as a bygone affair, that the vote of Florida was offered, or rather the certificates that would yield us the vote, but he said that the offer had been declined. Sometime last summer, about the time that the letter of Mr. Marble on the Electoral Commission appeared, I made a remark about the matter. I spoke to Colonel Pelton about this offer from Florida. He answered in a single sentence that all offers had been declined. That is all the knowledge I had on the subject until the publication of these dispatches. With respect to Oregon, I never saw any one of those dispatches. I now refer to dispatches that are contained in the Tribune Extra, number 44.
Mr. Springer asks Tilden. This pamphlet?
Tilden responds to Springer. Yes. I never saw any one of those dispatches in cipher or translation. The substance of no one of them was ever communicated to me, except a dispatch from Governor Grover stating that he would give the certificate to the Democratic electors. The substance of that dispatch was communicated to me by somebody. I did not know that it came in cipher until after it appeared in the examination by Mr. Morton's committee. And in what form that communication was made, I cannot now state, but I was aware of the fact. Some of the telegrams appear to have been addressed to Colonel Pelton at number 15 Gramercy Park, which is my residence. I asked one of my young men to look them over and tell me how many there were. I think he told me there were 15 of the Florida dispatches so addressed, chiefly sent from Mr. Marble. So far as I know or believe, none of those dispatches were ever delivered to my house.
Mr. Stenger asks, do you say chiefly sent to Mr. Marble?
Chairman to Stenger. He says chiefly sent from Mr. Marble.
Tilden, yes, chiefly sent by Mr. Marble. So far as I know, none of these were ever delivered at my house. Colonel Pelton's habits and ours and my own were entirely different. I was still governor of New York and had many executive duties to perform. I was burdened by the daily reception of people coming from all parts of the United States. From 3 to 5 hours a day were, I think, usually devoted to these receptions by me. Colonel Pelton seldom came into the house until after I had been long in bed. He was very busy at the committee rooms, and I saw very little of him. I think if any considerable number of telegrams had come to the house, I should have found it out in some way. I do not believe that any of these cipher telegrams ever came into my house. At any rate, they never met my eye, or came within my knowledge. Now, one word as to the gentleman who went to the South, to the disputed states, to watch and guard the canvass in behalf of the Democratic Party. That measure originated with either Mr. Hewitt or General Grant. Within a day or two after the election, I think, General Grant wrote a letter in which he proposed such an expedient. Mr. Hewitt either had started it before or embraced it immediately after. I did not select or send the gentlemen who went to those states. With few exceptions, they were not selected or sent after consultation with me. I did not attempt to supervise their action. I did not communicate with them. In no instance during the whole of that time did I ever communicate, directly or indirectly, with any gentleman who was in the South on that business. I never received any communication from any of them, except one, signed by Mr. Randall, Mr. Ottendorfer, Mr. Larmer, and Mr. Watterson, suggesting that some kind of a proposition should be made by me to Mr. Hayes. I never answered that dispatch except verbally to Mr. Ottendorfer after he returned and called on me. I was very busy all that time. I took it for granted that these gentlemen understood their business and I did not undertake to direct them. The idea that they were my personal agents in any sense has no foundation in fact. They were representatives and delegates of the Democratic Party, chosen generally by its organization. No man, so far as I know, ever went to any of those states with any commission, authority, or any contemplation to do anything that a gentleman ought not to do, or to do anything but defend the interests of the Democratic Party, and to watch and guard those interests against apprehended fraud. During the whole time, from the 7th day of November, 1876, which was the day of the election, until the 6th day of December the same year, which was the day on which the electors met and deposited their votes for transmission to Washington, I maintained a uniform attitude. My purpose was under no circumstances to enter any competition to obtain votes, the certificates of the canvassing boards of the disputed states, even those to which I believed we were entitled, except by discussion, argument, reason, truth, justice. To the people who, as I believe, elected me President of the United States, to the 4 millions and a quarter of citizens who gave me their suffrages, I owe duty, service, and every honorable sacrifice, but not a surrender of one jot or tittle of my sense of right or personal self-respect. Whatever disappointment to those who voted for me, whatever the public consequences of suffering a subversion of the elective system, by which alone free government, self-government can be carried on, by whatever casuistry, a different course might have been advocated or defended, I was resolved that, if there was to be an auction of the chief magistracy of my country, I would not be among the bidders.
The spectators loudly applaud Mr. Tilden.
Chairman, the room will be cleared if this applause does not cease. It is expressly understood that there is to be no manifestation of approbation or disapprobation on either side. Tilden waits for the room to quiet down before continuing.
Tilden continues, I was determined in such an event, or in the apprehension of such an event, that I would meet such a degraded condition of public affairs, not by sharing it in any degree, not by acquiescence, not by toleration, but by an unqualified and perpetual protest, appealing to the people to reassert and re-establish their great right, the greatest of their rights, the right without which all others are worthless. Their right to elective self-government. I have done so.
The cross-examination by the two Republicans Mr. Reed and Mr. Hiscock begins.
The chairman. Mr. Reed and Mr. Hiscock, will you ask Governor Tilden any questions?
Mr. Reed directs his attention to Tilden.
Reed. Governor Tilden, who was your private secretary at the time of these transactions?
Tilden. George Smith. Do you mean my private secretary personally or as governor?
Reed. Personally.
Tilden. George W. Smith.
I find among these telegrams in the Tribune 1. Number 40, addressed to George W. Smith, number 15 Gramercy Park, in the cipher which was used in these incriminating dispatches. It relates to a suggestion in regard to Oregon, and was transmitted by Mr. Manton Marble to George W. Smith, number 15 Gramercy Park. Did you ever see that dispatch?
I do remember having seen it.
Have you any impression in regard to it, whether you did receive it or not? Will you kindly look at the translation of the original?
I have no doubt Mr. Smith can tell. He is here. He has been summoned by the committee.
Well, sir. Can you?
I have no recollection of it.
None, whatever?
Tilden, reading, the governor suggested.
The translation follows it. Will you look over the translation and see if that recalls to your mind having received that dispatch?
Mr. Smith may have shown it to me. He will no doubt tell himself. I have no recollection of it.
Doesn't that suggestion in it about O'Connor's opinion recall anything to your mind?
I do not remember that Mr. O'Connor was ever applied to for an opinion on that subject.
Or that any suggestion was made that Mr. O'Connor's opinion should be obtained on the subject?
I do not remember. It might have been made.
You have read these various publications in reference to these dispatches.
I read them immediately on their publication.
Do you recollect one dispatch in this same cipher from Louisiana which began, Bigler to Russia, and was translated Bigler to Tilden? Do you recollect that?
I do not remember it.
Do you remember that which was also sent to George W. Smith, your private secretary. Do you remember if that dispatch was submitted to you?
I should think it likely that if Mr. Smith received the dispatch, he would have submitted it to me.
He was your private secretary, and if he had received either of these dispatches, it would have been his duty to submit them to you.
I think so.
Have you any doubt that he did?
He was my personal secretary.
Your personal secretary, precisely, that is what I mean.
Mr. Charles Evans was my secretary as governor.
It would have been Mr. Smith's duty to have submitted them to you. Have you any doubt that he did submit them?
I do not know anything about the existence of such a dispatch. I have no recollection about it.
It would seem, Governor Tilden, that your personal secretary had this cipher. Do you know whether he did or did not have it, of your own knowledge?
I do not think that he did have it.
How then were these dispatches translated if he not have the cipher?
He may not have been able to translate them. He may have had to get somebody else to do it.
What do you know about this cipher?
I do not know anything about it.
You never had it.
I never had it.
And you do not know what it was.
I could not have put any message into cipher. If I had tried, I could not have got anyone out of it.
I am merely suggesting that these dispatches seem to indicate that your personal private secretary had this same cipher which has been used in this incriminating dispatches. It would have given you an opportunity to state any facts in connection with them which will throw light upon that circumstance, which seems to be indicated. Have you any facts with which you can assist us?
He is here. He has been summoned by the committee.
Well, I want to know whether you ever knew that he had it.
I do not think he had the cipher at all, the cipher that was used at the Everett house.
When Colonel Pelton returned from Baltimore, did you have an interview with him?
I suppose I did.
Do you recollect whether you did or not?
No doubt I did.
Will you be kind enough to state what that interview was?
I cannot recall it in detail. I have no doubt I expressed impatience.
Will you give your best recollection as to the substance of that interview? Of course, I am not expecting you to repeat words, because none of us can do that, but will you give us the substance of what you said to him, and what he said to you?
I do not think he said anything to me. I think it was a mere outburst of impatience and displeasure that he had had anything to do with the Baltimore transaction.
And he made no reply?
I think he made no reply.
Mr. Springer interrupts. I did not hear what you said, Mr. Tilden.
I said my impression was that it was a mere outburst of displeasure and impatience on my part that he had anything to do with the transaction.
You knew, Governor Tilden, the position which Colonel Pelton occupied in relation to the Democratic National Committee.
I suppose so, yes, sir.
You knew he was acting secretary, and that these telegrams in large numbers were coming to him, did you not?
I knew that a great many telegrams were coming to him.
He was residing then at your house.
He was.
Note, Mr. George Smith afterwards testified that he never received this dispatch, that he never knew of its existence, or anything about it, except that he had seen it in publication in the hands of the committee, and in the regular issue of the New York Tribune.
Did you, after this Baltimore transaction came to your knowledge, make any effort or suggestion that he should be removed from the position in which you knew he was?
I don't think I did.
Why not?
In the first place, I did not know of the Baltimore transaction, except to the extent that he had been receiving an offer there. I did not know that he had made any negotiations or given any encouragement. I did not acquire any knowledge that these dispatches had passed backward and forward until their publication. In the conversation with Mr. Cooper, I did not acquire any information on the subject, except in a general way. I thought the best way to deal with the thing was to stop it, and I did stop it, and stopped it effectually. I did not believe it possible that any such transactions could be afterward renewed. Besides, I knew that Colonel Pelton had no power. He was sometimes called acting secretary, but he had command of no money. He had no actual power. He was not able to do anything without the concurrence of other men. I did not imagine he would attempt to do anything of the sort again.
Did not the fact that he had once attempted to do it give you an idea that he would be likely to do it again?
I did not suppose that he had attempted to do anything. I simply supposed he had received an offer.
Will you be kind enough to give us the conversation you had with Mr. Edward Cooper, as nearly as you can recall it?
I have given it to you in a general way.
I should like to press the question. I should like to have it as fully as you can give it, and if you will be kind enough to put it in the form of what he said, and what you said, I shall be obliged.
The conversation with Mr. Cooper did not occupy more than 5 or 10 minutes.
Did he begin the conversation?
He began the conversation.
What did he say? Or if you cannot give that, what was the substance of his opening remark?
He communicated to me the fact that Colonel Pelton was in Baltimore, the fact that Colonel Pelton was receiving an offer of this nature.
Did he tell you the amount of the proposition?
I think he probably gave it.
Did he tell you that he had received a telegram from Colonel Pelton asking for money?
I do not know whether he told me that or not. He may have done so.
What further conversation took place?
The substance of the conversation was that Pelton was in Baltimore and that the certificates of the canvassers of the state of South Carolina were offered and that he was down there doing something, dealing with them, or looking into it in some way.
Did he tell you anything about Colonel Pelton's having cautioned him not to tell you?
No.
Nothing of that sort was mentioned.
No, he did not mention that he had seen him the night before.
Where were you the night before?
I don't remember.
Do you remember whether you were in New York or not?
I think I was. I did not know that Colonel Pelton was going away.
When did you next hear of corrupt attempts, after this, in any of the states?
What do you mean by corrupt attempts?
I mean these corrupt transactions that are depicted here.
Do you mean attempts to sell or attempts to buy?
Both, Governor, or either.
I never heard of any attempt on the part of our people to buy. The atmosphere was full of rumors.
Have you not read these Smithweed dispatches, and the whole account which your nephew gives them? And after that do you say that you never heard of any attempt to buy? Do you mean to say that?
I mean to say that I did not hear at that time.
Will you say that you have never heard of any attempts to buy?
I meant up to the time of the publication of these dispatches.
But since then you have heard of it.
I regard those as attempts to sell, rather than attempts to buy.
It is a distinction which you, of course, have a right to make. With regard to these attempts to sell, when did you first hear of corrupt attempts to sell, subsequent to this Baltimore transaction?
I cannot say. The atmosphere was full of rumors.
At what time did you become conscious of this fullness of the atmosphere, Governor Tilden?
There were rumors at the investigation before Field's committee about cases of that kind. I met, last summer, a gentleman in the cars.
Well, I am not after this. I think I expressed it clearly. These criminal attempts either to buy or sell, which are mentioned here in the Tribune Extra, when did you first hear of them after the Baltimore experience?
I did not hear anything more about Baltimore or about South Carolina. That was the end of that. I did not hear anything about Florida till after the vote was given.
Who first told you of the Florida performance? I will use a neutral term.
I cannot remember. I first heard of it after the gentleman that went to Florida had returned.
Did Mr. Marble tell you?
Mr. Marble told me some time, I think it was later.
Are you aware that Mr. Marble has testified that he never told you of it?
Mr. Stenger corrects Reed. He cannot be aware of that because Mr. Marble did not so testify.
I understood him so.
Mr. Stenger to Reed, I think you are mistaken.
I said I do not know whether it was before I went to England or not. Mr. Marble mentioned to me some time that the certificate of Florida was offered.
Was it before what is called the Ark and Shekinah letter?
Yes, sir.
Did he tell you the particulars of the transmission of those dispatches?
He did not.
Did he make any talk to you about this being a danger signal that he transmitted?
He did not.
He never alluded to it in those words or anything like it.
He merely mentioned the circumstance.
How did he mention it?
He mentioned it as a past transaction.
In what terms, as nearly as you can recollect? Will you give us the conversation?
He said the Florida certificates were for sale. I did not inquire into the particulars for several reasons. In the first place, it was long past, and he mentioned it like any other fact in bygone history.
He did not give you details, and you did not ask for them.
I did not make any inquiry.
Did you make any inquiries of your nephew as to the particulars of this South Carolina matter?
I did not.
Why not?
I did not think it was necessary.
Did you not feel any interest in it?
I only felt an interest in stopping it.
Then you did not regard that as a danger signal.
Regard what is a danger signal?
The transmission of the propositions in any way.
Are you speaking of South Carolina?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Springer to Mr. Reed. Marble's dispatch was with reference to Florida.
Regard what is a danger signal?
The transmission of the propositions in any way.
Are you speaking of South Carolina?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Springer to Mr. Reed. Marble's dispatch was with reference to Florida.
I do not know what you mean by danger signals.
Would it occur to you that the transmission of a proposition to sell would be a danger signal?
I should think that a man who had the power to sell and made the proposition wanted to sell.
And the man who transmitted it would transmit it rather for the purpose of purchase than as a danger signal.
That would depend on the motives of the man who transmitted it.
Colonel Pelton is a nephew of yours.
Yes, sir.
When did he first begin to reside in your house?
About 9 years ago, I think.
When did he cease his residence there?
About the 1st of July.
He had been your military secretary while you were governor, and was at the time of these transactions your military secretary.
He was.
And with your knowledge and consent was the acting secretary of the Democratic National Committee.
He was not with my consent, though he was with my knowledge.
You knew it.
I knew he called himself acting secretary.
You knew he was really acting secretary.
I knew he was very active in the business.
And that he was really acting secretary.
I came down from Albany in the latter part the 3rd or 4th week of September. The canvass was 2/3 completed while I was in Albany. When I came down here I found Colonel Pelton acting as secretary.
Did you make any objection to his acting as secretary?
I did.
To whom?
To several gentlemen of the committee.
Will you kindly name them?
I cannot now.
Cannot you name any of them?
No.
Did you make any objection to him, and request him to cease acting in that capacity?
I did not request him to cease, but I was not pleased with it for several reasons.
Did you manifest your displeasure to him?
I manifested my regret.
To whom?
To him.
What did he say?
I cannot tell you.
But you did not go to the extent of insisting on his ceasing to act in that capacity.
I did not. I have no hesitation in stating to you all about it.
Of course I cannot go into the whole matter, I only want to go into certain aspects of it. Did you know Mr. Smith M. Weed?
Yes, sir.
How long have you known him?
I cannot say, some years.
Has he been in confidential relations with you?
No more than many prominent Democrats.
But as much as other prominent Democrats.
As much as some and less than others.
When did you first know he was in South Carolina?
Not till after he came back.
Was it concealed from you?
I do not know. No, I guess not.
How did it happen that you did not know he was there?
Because I did not undertake to know all that was being done by the committee.
Did you not undertake to keep the general run of it, and of what was going on in the South?
Not a very close run.
Well, you undertook to keep the run of it, didn't you? End of Chapter 6, Part 2, remainder of testimony will be read by the narrator.